Hi, I'm Bob Sandheinrich. I'm talking about the Wolfram Data Repository, and we're going to look at different use cases for using the new data repository to do analytics on data and create your own data resources. Oftentimes there's inconsistent file formats between data sets. The data is not structured in a consistent way between data sets or even within a data set. There's no documentation about how to use it or examples of using it. In the worst case scenario, you just have a web page with links to another web page with links to another web page with links, and then eventually there's a PDF with a graph in it. And how are you supposed to do anything with that? And that's mostly a result of these things not really being designed with the use case of somebody ever using the data. They're designed so that some publisher can say that they've published their data and point people to it as required by their funding or their journal or whatever. So we realized that we were in a position to do it a lot better. And that's because of the cloud and the Wolfram language. So the fact that we have a cloud means that everything in the data repository has a natural mechanism for distribution. So anywhere you can access the cloud, which is increasingly every Wolfram language session anywhere, you can get the data from the data repository. And the Wolfram language has what we call WDF, or the Wolfram Data Framework, which is a standard for representing data that is consistent, and it has semantics and real-world knowledge built into it. So it's a great way to have data that's immediately computable and usable. So these are sort of the pieces of the data repository. So when we talk about the data repository, we're talking about all these things. There's a website. Stephen showed it in his talk yesterday. It's been live since April, where each what we call resource is the unit of the data repository is a resource. Each resource has its own web page. There's a home page, there's a guide page to direct you, there's a search tool, and we'll see that all in a minute. Another key piece is the Wolfram language function. So like I said, we want the data to be easy to get. So there's built-in symbols in the Wolfram language now that get that data and get the metadata as well from the data repository. There's the back end is all in our cloud, so that it's not necessarily important for anybody to know that, but it's neat to know that all of this was built using our own technology. So it's all Wolfram language code. Some of it's running on your machine, some of it's running in our cloud, but there's not a lick of anything else. So anybody with a cloud subscription and the time and ambition could have made this themselves. It didn't need to be us, but we saw the opportunity, so we went for it. And then, of course, the most important part is content. No matter how great the technology is, no one's going to care about this thing if there's not good content. So and the fact that we are the company that made Wolfram Alpha means we know a lot about data curation and where to find data and how to import it and parse it and store it. So we took advantage of that knowledge and found great data sets and got them in there for launch, and then it's consistently growing. So we're somewhere 600 or so resources last time I checked. So the rest of this talk is going to be over these use cases. So sort of an escalating set of use cases, from just sort of poking around the website to using the data in the Wolfram language to creating your own resources, and finally to submitting those resources for publication. So we'll step through these. So we can go ahead and look at the website. This is the home page. We can see there's a short description. There's a search bar here where you can search for keywords or terms that might be in the description. And then we've divided all of the resources along two dimensions, with the category of the resource and the content type. So you can have astronomical data that's a graph, or economic data that's an entity store. So we'll just pick one of these randomly. So here's things about medicine. And we can, the medicine ones are all sort of depressing. We'll find a different one. Let's look at economics. So here, let's just pick this guy. So what's great about this, so if you look at the page for an individual resource, well, this one's really small. We'll find another one to actually play with. So it has a title, it has a description, it's sort of a short description, a more detailed description, some summary of the size, and then it has this example section, which is really great because it shows you, it not only gives you an idea of what the data actually looks like, but it shows you right away how to use it in Wolfram language. So we have this example notebook with input and output cells, just like any notebook. And then we have this link to open it in the cloud. We can try that out, see how my network's doing here. So here you go. You're running in the cloud, and you can evaluate these things right away in the cloud. And then we have a citation. So if you want to take our data and use it in something you're doing, you can cite it. And then we have our source where we acquired the data. So we give credit where it's due. Finally, down to the bottom, we have download buttons that first, if you don't want to use this in the Wolfram language, you just want to download it. Maybe your colleague doesn't have Mathematica and isn't willing to try it. You can send them JSON or CSV or something more standard. Well, we'll go ahead and use this guy. So all of these are like the online documentation where you can click on them and go straight into a notebook. So now we're moving into that one step further, where instead of just sort of poking around at the notebook, you're retrieving the data. So let's see, Federal Reserve Systems. We're getting it. Sometimes the outputs have some typesetting that takes a while to display. Let's see. You can tell that I authentically chose a random one. Let's try it like this. Oh, that's a bad one. All right. Let's look at just the first row, maybe. There we go. Okay. So something about outputting all these entities is slipping things up. So in that case, I was going to grab one randomly and do some simple analysis, but I'll just use one I already figured out how to do something good with, so that we don't waste a lot of time waiting for entities to typeset. So here's one where we have data about weather stations. So it's looking at the frequency of rain over months. You can see here's the first 5. I can use take large. So this is data set. So you can use take largest as the first argument applied to the data set, and it'll give you the rain station that had the most frequent rain in January. If I want just the coordinates, I can do that. If I want to do this for all the months, I can grab the keys that way, get it for all the months. Okay, so there's the coordinates for each month. Let's use it. Let's put them in a geomarker and use a tooltip so we know which one is which month. That's great. We got our tooltips there. And you can throw it into geographics. And here we have this nice little, this one line of code that grabs stuff from the data repository and does something interesting with it. So that's using the data. But what's also important about data repository and resource objects in general is that they contain metadata. So when you have the resource object, so here's what the resource object looks like in a notebook. It has this what we call a summary blob, where you can look inside and see some metadata for it. And you can also access that metadata just by asking for. So these are the metadata fields that are available. Some of them are less useful than others. Some of them are just sort of implementation things that are going on behind the scenes. But you can see what categories this is. So I think I found it. Oh no, maybe I found it in meteorology, but it could have also been in earth science on the website. We have the source metadata, the same thing that we saw at the bottom of the web page, is available from the resource object itself. And you can see this, in addition to the actual content of the data being in WEF, The metadata is WF too. We have entities, data objects. So even the metadata is computable. And then we have content elements. So there's the default content, which for this case was the data set. That's what we saw on the last page. But this resource actually contains 4 pieces of content that if you use a second argument in resource data, you can grab the other ones. So here, column descriptions is treated as the content of this as well, and you can see instead of just the little Jan, Feb, Mar, you can actually get useful descriptions for these things. So that's sort of an example of grabbing a resource from the web page and using it in the language. But if you want to just work in the language itself, we also have resource search, which is a handy function. So we have a lot of what we call sample resources, and these are resources that are not necessarily big historical canonical data sets from the most prestigious literature. They're something that is useful for a certain kind of computation or analysis. It's nice to have this kind of image to test this kind of image processing function. It's nice to have data about plant growth because it's a good test for a certain statistical distribution. So these are sort of samples. So we have a whole bunch of samples. So I chose that search. And I'm going to test randomness again and grab one of these randomly. Let's look at what it is. Some of these are sort of depressing. I said that. I warned you about that. So again, we can grab the data. So, and of course, this is a data set, so you can do all sorts of computation. The last presentation here actually showed a pretty good example of that. And I got started late, so I'm not going to attempt to do anything interesting with that one right now. So once you've used data resources and you want to step it up to the next use case, it's time to make your own with your own data. So here I have some. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been collecting data on everybody here, how happy they are every minute since you've been here, and I actually already have that data for the rest of the conference as well. So I've taken that and I've put that into this field called content. I said this is a data resource. It has a name. It has a description, and then I just put that association to resource object, and it's a resource object. And it works exactly like the resources from the data repository. Once it's defined locally, it's treated just like the ones that are published on our website. So this is one way to create it programmatically. But the better way to create a data resource is with this template notebook that we call a definition notebook. So this came out in 11.1, I think, this notebook. So it has fields for all the metadata, extended metadata here, categories, content types. It would take more time than we have here to actually fill those out manually. So what I did is I made one already. So all I did was I went to this page about Babe Ruth, Bambino, and I created one. I filled out one of these before, and I put it in my cloud. So here's this notebook that has names, descriptions, has the metadata, categories filled out. I put in some keywords. And then we get to the content area. And just to prove that this works, I'll paste this in again. So here what I'm using is semantic import string. In order for this to work well, so you want to give it what you expect the type of each column to be. And even then, if the data isn't really well filled out or consistent, this will tend to have issues. So there's a whole art to properly formatting your data that I don't have time to get to, but we'll talk about resources for that in a second. So here we have this nice data set where we have data objects and quantity objects and numbers and strings and proper columns. So if I just go through and everything with this little wolfie here means that Bob wants you to evaluate it. So that's defining the content. Here I'm defining the example notebook that will be used, that'll be retrievable by users, and it will be used to create that web page that we've seen. So then I have this guy that creates the symbol $$ resource object. So that turns this notebook into a resource object. I could copy this, use it in any other notebook. And it'll work just like the ones in the public repository or the one I created programmatically. But once you have one of the point of having a resource object is that you can put it somewhere. So you can cache it locally. You can, oops, I don't know what that's about. You can, but what we're going to look at now is you can deploy it to a cloud object. So if you cloud deploy this resource object, what you get when you visit in a browser is this nice web page that looks a lot like the ones in our public data repository with a name and a description. And here's your nice example notebook rendered out, all in HTML. So you can direct your colleagues here. And what's even better is that they can take this resource object here, and if they're Wolfram language users, oh, sorry, where'd this guy go? They can just use it directly. So the fact that I set in that notebook, if you saw, I said permissions go to public. So if you have public permissions on your deployment, then your colleagues, whoever you send that cloud object to, can use that resource object directly. Let's see, where'd my notebook go? The last thing you want to do if you think your resource is generally interesting and not just for you and your colleagues is you might want to submit it for publication. And for that, you'll need a publisher ID. I'm going to talk about that in the next talk. So if you're interested in publishing, stay tuned. I'll have a slide in a couple minutes about that. For now, I'm just going to use the one that I have access to, and I'm going to give a note like, this is a demo. Do not publish it. And that way, sorry, I'm not good at typing. Publish it. So my colleagues won't get overambitious because I don't think I have legal rights to the web page that I scraped. So that gives me a resource submission object. It puts my submission in a queue. A human being will come around and review it, and either they'll approve it and it'll be published, or they'll contact me and say, hey, this doesn't meet our standards for the following reasons, or this data set just isn't really interesting enough for us. So that's sort of a manual process that involves humans. So that brings up the question of what do we want to submit, what is interesting. So we want vetted data. Things from publications are great. We want you to attribute it properly. We want you to tell us that you have the rights to publish it. We want you to write a nice little description about it. And then, of course, it should be in WDF. So it should have quantities, entities. It should be semantically computable. And like I said, I don't have time to show you a good example of that. But Aaron Enright, one of our other developers here, has made 3 Twitch videos. It's sort of a 3-part segment, and it's great. So if you can't wait until you stand up to see it, go ahead and scan one of these QR codes. Otherwise, get the notebook, and here's the links. Or you can search Twitch for Wolfram data scraping, Wolfram data processing, something like that, and you'll find Aaron's 3 half-hour videos, and that's the best resource. So that's the end of the talk on data repository. If any of you want to get to another talk, what time is it? Am I? Okay, so yeah, we got 5 minutes if you want to head to another talk, or you can ask, since it's still me, we can ask questions right up to the next talk.
How much of your interface with government? So like a lot of this data will come from Zero or whatever. How much of your interface with?
I don't have a number, but it's not insignificant. I would probably guess more than a quarter, less than half, if I had to guess. Like I said, we want well-vetted sources. So data.gov, if you can figure out how to get the data, is a nice source of data.
The agencies themselves using our resources to publish the data.
Oh, how much? Oh, well, that's the goal, is to get them to do it themselves. So far, we've been doing it for them. Yeah.
Has there been outreach for that, or?
I hope. I don't know. I'm just a developer. I'm just a developer. We have sales and partnerships people that do that. Any other data repository specific things?
Is the data repository part of the standard mathematical license agreement, or is that something separate you have to purchase?
It's standard, yeah. So
Part of the general
yeah. So in order to use it, you'll want to have a cloud account, but those are free.
right?
So you need, yeah. Do you need it?
Access it through the cloud?
You can access it in desktop or in cloud, right? Some of these data sets are so massive they hit a cloud memory limit when you try to use them. So desktop is sometimes better, but the ones that aren't the really big ones work either place just fine. And yeah, so you need a Wolfram ID so you can cloud connect, but those are free. So, and hopefully everybody was convinced to do that 2 years ago. Any other data repository specific questions, or we can move ahead? Yeah.
How would you report an error?
That's a good question. So we have our standard technical services where you can report things, where you can report bugs in Wolfram language. You could report there as well. There's also on the web page, there's contact us. Let's see. If we go here, there's homepage, there's contact us. So you can report it here as well. That might be the more direct route.
Related to that, how can you update your data?
Yeah, so if you are the submitter of data, then in this form or in resource submit, you might have seen it here because it's highlighted in, oh no, it's not. So if you give it this option of update resource and you point that at the existing published resource or even submission object, so maybe you have something that you've submitted and we've said, hey, it's incomplete for this reason, and you want to update your submission, you can use that as well there. So that update resource value.
Yes. You mentioned besides Wolfram language output, JSON, CSV, TSV. To me, that implies the data are essentially tabular. Can you support things that are not
Yeah,
tables?
and they just won't have CSV outputs. We have images where instead of those buttons saying CSV, they would have said JPEG and PNG. We have graphs where our only option is to get a Wolfram language representation.
Deeply nested associations to represent my data.
Right. Yeah. So then your only option is going to be a Wolfram language representation of it because nothing else is really useful. Yeah. We do have this expression JSON format, which turns any expression into valid JSON, but I don't know of any place where it's useful besides bringing it back into Wolfram language. Yes.
I've been using Sparkle to make all kinds of databases from Wikipedia queries. What's the likelihood of something like that being accepted for public consumption?
Right. So I guess I saw a talk about that yesterday where it seems like we are adding support for RDF stuff.
No, I mean,
Or,
if I have
no,
a database that I've
right.
created.
Right. I understand. I'm getting there. So in order for us to want to put something in the data repository, it must be useful in Wolfram language. So at the point where that is released and all of a sudden RDF type data is very useful in Wolfram language, we would love to have it. Absolutely. Yes.
So I was talking about this earlier with somebody, but so Wolfram Alpha also has its own repository of its own data that it's curated separately. Could you explain the relationship between the Wolfram data repository and Wolfram Alpha's own collection of source data?
Right. So Wolfram Alpha is the primary goal is to set it up for queries. And it's structured in that way. Whereas this is not. This is set up to retrieve data sets, whole cloth, and do your own tools on them. I can call out my colleague Alan in the back, who's raising his hand, he's an expert on both the Wolfram data repository data and the Wolfram Alpha data, and can expand on that for as long as you are willing to let him.
That's a bold offer.
Any other, or we can move on to the next talk? All right.